Hey guys, this is another Let's Build with JavaScript, and I'm sitting in the dark because there's a super bright light otherwise, and so if you're asking immediately why I'm doing that, that's why. Yeah, this one's going to be a modal dialog. So typically with a modal, it's just like another layer of a page coming off of a current page that's hidden by default. And the concept here is to write it in vanilla JavaScript. For this particular example, I reached for Tailwind. It is a CSS utility-driven framework. If you haven't heard of it, definitely check it out. I've become a very big advocate of atomic CSS and utility-based CSS to write my CSS because it's a way to, you're basically including a bunch of classes inside your DOM elements, and it's styling them based on what you pick. Like each class kind of does one thing as opposed to many things. So that's not to say that that's the best way to write CSS in the end, because you're still going to have some cases where you need some more componentized classes or IDs or whatever, however you write your CSS. So I mix atomic with like BIM, like kind of a hybrid model. Just basically try to limit as much CSS as I write custom as possible is the end game, just for performance and scalability. So enough about CSS. We have a basic container here. It's got, let me expand this. Our HTML looks like this. We've got our trigger modal button, which is what you see right here. Inside that, it's in a container property, which is part of Tailwind as well. And then we're doing some flexbox stuff to just center it more or less. And the modal underneath is hidden by default. Right now I have it set to be hidden with custom CSS because I want to add a open class with JavaScript when it does launch, when you do get a click event on the button. So to do that seems pretty trivial, but it's a little more involved, just getting things to fire correctly, as well as when you do click a modal, instead of just closing it with a close button, I want to be able to click off of it and close it as well. So that presents some more issues. On top of that, I tried to code this with as much accessibility as possible. So you'll see some roles and ARIA attributes, I think, throughout. So it's just something to take into note or account as you code your own things, because it helps accessibility for blind folks or colorblind folks, anyone who's trying to access this stuff, and either use key commands or get voice recognition, stuff like that. It's very important and shouldn't be overlooked. So definitely keep that in mind. I won't go through and like basically recreate this because it's a little redundant. Feel free to reference this pin, which I'll link to. I am using an actual button to display the close button, which will be what you see after this. I could probably just show you what it looks like. Let's just comment these first two lines out. And there it is. So that'll eventually fire when we listen for a click event and do a few things. And that's going to be the look of the modal, which is going to be a position fixed element over top of what other stuff exists there. So with Tailwind, we're able to go into the modal, which is right here, and it's got the role dialog, hence the accessibility there. Fixed is going to say, hey, that stays fixed within the window. Pin is like a top, left, right, and bottom 0 declaration. And that's just a quick, like, one class way to write pin this document across the whole screen. And then you can set different parameters with padding, width, height, margin, z-index, and margin top. So z-index is important for some of these things because the modal needs to be on top of everything, but then we want the container of the modal on top of the modal, which is, I know, confusing, but that's just how it's going to be to work this way. So in here you see an empty div, which is the actual overlay, and that's this teal background, and we need that because that's just kind of overlaying the whole document, so we're focused in on this actual dialogue. So enough chit chat. I will get into the JS, and you might notice I have actual classes. No, I actually don't in this one. But I have a modal trigger class and a couple other ones that we might reference with JavaScript as we go. So that's just important to have, which typically if I'm going to write custom JavaScript, I like to prefix it with like a JS modal trigger, something like JS, just so it's like obvious what that is. Like I shouldn't remove that at any time if I'm refactoring, because I know that JS is probably tied to it somewhere. So that's just a quick hint of maybe a way to at least make it more legible to other developers if you team up with people. All right, so with this ready, we're gonna declare two functions, and one's gonna be to open the modal and one is to close. So let's start with the open. So I'm gonna write its own function, open modal. So we've opened that, and within that we're going to just go with some ES6, kind of just letting stuff, declaring the modal trigger. So we want to be able to reuse this on any modal we use on the site. So that's the whole point of like a reusable component, and that's what I'm after with this. So instead of giving it a fixed ID that you're only going to use once, or just a set query selector to it, I want to actually find that trigger by finding all of the triggers that have the modal trigger class. So let's do document.query selector all, hence all in that one. We're going to find all of them. Then I'll do a class modal trigger. And that correlates right here to this class. So we're accessing the actual trigger element, which is an href in this case. I've been at least told, not told, but I've heard you should just always use button elements to be more accessible in these cases instead of links, because links are supposed to redirect you elsewhere. I probably should have used the button here, but it's actually important. I need the href attribute on this to do this particular thing, but I guess we could have added an href to the button too, so choose your poison there. Okay, so assuming we have more than one modal trigger, we're going to use the for each loop to loop through all of those, which is an array in an essence, so it's a node list. If you console logged, I'll do that just to show you. Modal trigger. And I'll open my console, and let's see if we need to actually fire our open modal function. So let's do open modal like that, and it should come back with the node list, which is an array. So you see there's actually 0 correlates to the first one, which there's only one on the page. So if we were to add 2, this might update. 2. So now there is 2 there. 0, 1. Cool. I'm going to undo that real quick. So that gives me the idea that there's multiple things on the page, and then we can loop through each of those. So for each means you can actually loop through a prototype array, as you see here, which it has to be an array for this to work. So we'll pass a function, which is important there, and then you can give it a argument, which is going to be what the instance of the modal trigger is in this case. So I'll close that. So within here we can do things. So I'll actually take the trigger declaration there, or argument. I'll add an event listener on that specific one. If I can spell listener, and then it's going to be a click in this case. So I'll pass a function through, and this is gonna, you can pass the actual event itself through that function. So I'll just call it the event here so it's obvious. So every add event listener, you can do this callback function where you can pass that event through. We'll use that event to prevent default on this link because we don't want it to actually visit anywhere else. So what I'll do is first let's go and I'm going to make a comment, remove the hashtag from what will be modal, and we're going to access that by finding the href of the target. So to do that, we'll set a variable called const target, and this will be this, which is referring to the trigger dot get attribute, and then we'll pass, spell it right, I'll pass href through, and then we'll do this call substring 1, which basically subtracts however many numbers you pass here from the string from the beginning. So in this case, I can console.log target, I can spell, I'll do that after the fact. We need to click on the modal, cool. So if I remove this, you'll see what I mean, ultimately what it's doing real quick. So that updates, we trigger, and it has the hashtag there. So that's just literally pulling this attribute value out. So we want to remove that because we're going to actually tie that target to the actual ID of the modal. So you see how those two are connected. So whatever you pass from the href on any modal coming up, if you want to define a custom name on it, so say it's like a contact form, you could pass contact form here and then contact form here in the ID. So those things, they correlate, and they must be the same for this to work. For our sake, I'll just use modal, just because it's kind of I'll use it as a global component, perhaps. I'm going to clear my console. Okay, so now that we have that in memory, we need to find a way to essentially reference the modal itself. So we'll do use a dynamic target to reference the given modal in mention. So it'll be the particular modal we're targeting with that ID, which is going to be the target. So to do that, we'll do const modal window equals document dot get element by ID, and then we'll pass in the target. So you'll see, if you remember, the target was modal, and to find the modal, we want to do that dynamically. We don't want to just have to type the get element by ID and then type modal in here, because we won't always know which overlay or modal to use, because I want this to be reusable, as you remember. So in this case, it's subtracting that hashtag, it's passing in modal itself, which is the ID of our modal, and that's how we reference it. So it's kind of neat, and it's automatic, which is great, but you definitely need to make sure your ID and your href are matching in terms of the naming conventions. Okay, so then we could say if the modal window dot class list, just basically if it has class, then we can say modal window dot class list dot add, and it'll just say open. And finally, to round out, since we captured our event and we're passing it through this function here, we can go and prevent default just as a cautionary measure, because we don't want that link to actually go anywhere. So in theory, this should fire a modal, and open correlates to this class we've added here in our Sass. So when I click that, we're adding that class to the actual modal itself. So if I go and find the modal, I can reference the source, I think. This might be crazy in this view. Yeah, modal fixed. You see open was added right here. So pretty cool. And then close doesn't work yet, as you can see. And I click off and nothing happens. So that's next. Let's work on that bit. So that's going to be its entire own function. So right now we're just calling open modal after we're declaring it. I'll just move this down and have that do its thing. So let's say close modal. So this will be a little more cumbersome and a few more things to do, because we're going to do actually two inner workings. We want that close button to actually close the modal, and then we want clicking outside of the actual container of the modal to close the modal. So anywhere that was teal to close it. So to do that, I need a few variables, and we're going to go and find all the close buttons, similar to how we did the targets on the open. So we can do a document.query selector all, and it'll be modal close, which is the class I just basically gave it. So you can find that in our HTML over here, right here, which is another button with an SVG icon I pulled in. And then, so that's getting all those, and then we're going to say let modal overlays equals the same thing. So we're going to find all the modal overlays that are basically on the page. And it'll actually be overlay. Okay, so with those we can begin. And first we're going to take the close buttons and do a for each again, since again that's an array. And we'll do the same function and pass in, we'll just call it button. You can call that whatever you want at that point. I like to use something of relation to what I'm working with. It makes more sense. A lot of people use just like random letters and stuff, and I find that confusing. So do whatever you prefer there. So we're going to say target the whole modal. And then we'll say const modal window again equals this. Okay, this might be a little challenging. Parent node. So I want to traverse the DOM to find the actual modal based on the button, the close button that it's in, and I want to do that dynamically. So a way to do that is first passing, basically console log is your friend at this point. So if we do console.log, and we'll say, you could say this in this case, this refers to the button and mention. So let's first we have to remember to fire the function or call it. So I'll do that, and then in our console, option command I on a Mac if you're not 100% familiar. We've got this undefined command. I think I might have spelled. Oh, I forgot something. So taking a step back, we need to go and add an event listener on the button. So I'll do button.add event listener. Click. Do another function. We can pass the event again. And then this will wrap everything here. And don't forget to close the semicolon. Okay, so this should do a better job. So if we go here and click this button, we get the actual button in mention, which is this in this case. So it's referring to this button, or the one we passed through here in our for each loop. Okay, so then we can say I like Firefox for this reason particularly. You see this caret down, and you can see all the things associated with this element, and it's really helpful for finding like relatives or siblings or children of things, as opposed to just knowing what it would be. So what I did is basically this. I looked through this list and found what's close to what I want, and there's this parameter called parent element, and that takes me to the actual modal container first off. It was actually parent node, excuse me. So this one here, it's the same kind of thing, but just with different name. If I do this dot parent mode, we get, let me close this. We get the actual div we were looking at just earlier, and that's one step in the right direction. I actually want to get one step further. So the parent node for this is the modal class, which is what we want. So I don't want to actually reference the modal like directly. I want to find it dynamically, and doing so, the way the position of the close button is in our DOM right now, assuming we don't move it around or go crazy with it, I can access the modal class in that way. So that might be confusing, but it's a way to do it dynamically, and that's again what I'm all about. So in this case, if I trigger the modal again, let me clear this so it's obvious. Trigger it, and I'll close it, and then we get our modal entirely, which is what I am totally after. So hopefully that makes sense. So with that done, we have the whole modal at our disposal. Below that, we'll take the modal window and essentially just remove that open class we added when we opened it. So we'll say modal window.classlist.remove and then open. Done. So trigger modal, close modal, trigger modal, close modal. Pretty cool. If you wanted to get fancy, you could add classes on the modal itself, so maybe it fades in or something. That would be like an animation you can add in CSS. I didn't go through that and do any of that. Feel free to extend this if you want. This button also, it doesn't do anything, but it's just there for aesthetics. On top of that, I want to close the modal by clicking over here. Right now I can't close it by clicking over here because this button, while it works, it's not always obvious that that's there to close this, even though I think it's pretty obvious. So within the same function close modal, we're going to do another for each loop on the overlays. So we'll say modal overlays, which is the variable we set here, which targets all the modal overlays, and we'll do another for each and pass a function, and then through that we'll say overlay. That's what I called it. And then again we'll get the modal window, and to do that in this case it's going to be a little easier, so we could just say modal window equals overlay, which is again our argument we passed, our instance, and then parent node. So we did something similar to like we did before. So we get the whole modal using overlay argument. So if you console this, first I'll do overlay, and then I'll show you how I got to parent node, which I think you'll probably get by now. So if we click here, we get the modal overlay, but I want one step up. I want the whole modal, which is wrapping this overlay. So if you go to parent node, you'll see it there, and that's how we get it. So if I just pass parent node in, and then trigger the modal once, click anywhere in the color, and you'll see a new event logged, and then we have our modal. Pretty cool. Alright, so with that we can go and close the modal based on that click. So let's say close modal if click event is fired on overlay background. And then we'll say overlay, since that's the instance we have, we'll add an event listener, and it'll be click, pass a function, again the event. So within this listener, we can target that modal window variable we made. And again, the class list dot remove open. And then finally, we'll prevent default again. Not that we need to, because it's not an actual binded element. So I'll actually remove that. I think we don't even need to pass the event through. Okay, so with that, everything should work. We can clean this up a bit, maybe do a fancy onload function I added for some reason. I'm not 100% sure why, but something extra. So now if I click anywhere outside of the container, I'm clicking the container right now, nothing's happening. If I click just outside of it, it closes. So it's pretty sweet. Same with the close button. So there's your modal. Again, animations would make this a little more nice. Just something very simple and smooth. But on top of that, we have these two open functions here. And while it's nice to have these just fired in order like this, we could do something where you actually create another function and say like fire when ready. Pass in the function. We'll call it func. And then we can just add another event listener to the actual document. And what we can do is there's a special one called DOM content loaded, which basically says wait for the page to load before you do these things. So then we can pass in a function for each one. And then all we have to do is, similarly to what we did here, is call our functions, but without the actual curly braces. So it would be, or parentheses, excuse me. So it would be calling that function, spell it right, and it's gonna just be open modal, close modal. So that's a way to do it. You can also do another function if you want to just like have an initializer function and just do function init, and then basically any new function you add, you can add within this. And then, oops, I need this bit. And then you could just call init instead. And then the bigger app gets, you can start namespacing it. So you could be like, a common thing to do is like, I don't know, like webcrunch dot I don't know, like modal, and then you create a new object, and then you could just say like webcrunch dot modal dot init, and that's how you could like reference this giant namespace under webcrunch. I'll probably get into more of that later on as I learn more myself. It's kind of foreign to me still, but I'm learning, so that's nice. Namespacing is useful for the sake of conflicting code, so you don't write code that can conflict with other scripts later or somewhere else in your app or website, something like that. So I think that about does it, guys. Hopefully you found this useful. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to leave comments. I'm going to remove that init and just go with the flow here. Oops, let me undo that real quick. I'll just do this bit. People have asked me what like theme I use and stuff here. Let me see if I can show you. So Oceanic Dark, Sublime Text are my key bindings. I prefer Source Code Pro for my fonts, and it's at 15 pixels. Use 2 spaces instead of indents or tabs. I'm not a fan of tabs so much. I include auto prefixer normalize by default and use Babel as my preprocessor of choice. Yeah, I pretty much just have all these options enabled. I've tried to go to a light theme recently and just haven't had much luck with that. So if you found that useful, great. Let me know if you have any other ideas for these kind of builds. I'm open to ideas. I'm trying to keep it based around components more or less than like full-scale apps like I've been doing on the Rails side. Also continuing the Rails thing, so don't think I haven't stopped that. Actually working on a new project with that coming up that hopefully you'll dig. I'm hoping, the time depending, I'll get something at least public so you can at least look forward to it. So look for that to come. Appreciate a like or subscribe. If you have friends that might like this kind of stuff, feel free to share it with them. I'd appreciate it. All right, peace.